Well, I think there'll be demolition. I don't think it's going to be controlled in any way. Revaluing gold, our official value, I mean, doesn't change anything. That's just an accounting. It means nothing because, we're not doing anything with the gold. And if the U.S. government was going to sell the gold, it wouldn't sell it at $42. It would sell it for the market price. So it doesn't change anything. There are people who think, well, this gives us extra money to spend. No, it doesn't. It doesn't give us anything. I know, like Senator Loomis says, well, let's revalue the gold and then use the money to buy Bitcoin. What money? There is no money. There's just the gold. You don't get any extra money. But if what she's saying is, well, let's use the gold and somehow print more money. Let's have the Fed print up a bunch of money because we've now officially recognized what the gold is worth. And then we're going to take that new money that we just printed and use it to buy Bitcoin. It's like, okay, let's create inflation and buy Bitcoin, right? Why would we do that, right? Why would we just debase the currency just to go out and buy Bitcoin? So it doesn't solve any problem. The only thing that would make sense about a revaluation of gold is if we're going to maybe go back on a gold standard, have an official devaluation of the dollar, including of our debt. Because if we were to say, okay, gold is now $20,000 an ounce, and we're going to repay our debts in gold at $20,000 an ounce, right? So now, we've basically defaulted on a lot of our debt without really defaulting because we're going to pay it off in gold. And we just said that the gold is now worth 20,000 or 30,000 an ounce. So we wipe out 90% of our debt. But it doesn't even make sense to do that unless you're going to peg the dollar to gold and maintain that. Initially, of course, the dollar wasn't pegged to gold. The dollar was gold. I mean, that was the literal definition of a dollar. A dollar was a weight of gold. That's what it was, right? It was a way to measure gold. If you had a certain quantity of gold, it was called a dollar. That was the legal definition. So gold was our money. Our money wasn't backed by gold. Our money was gold. What we eventually did is we created currency that was backed by money, but the currency was never money. It was a money substitute that you could use instead of money because it was more convenient than money. But what gave currency value was the money that backed it up, which was gold. So if we were to go back on that standard, yeah, that'd be great. And we can't do it unless we devalue the dollar officially and reprice gold. But I don't see any appetite in Congress to do that because that would mean they'd have to cut spending. And so, but they're not cutting spending now. So why do they want to go back on a gold standard that would force them to cut spending? The reason we went off the gold standard is because politicians wanted to spend a lot of money that they didn't have. Gold was preventing them from doing that. And, when I hear people in the crypto community say, oh, gold didn't work, gold failed. Gold worked perfectly. That's why the U.S. government abandoned it, because it was doing its job. It would have stopped them from deficit spending. It would have forced politicians to make difficult political choices that they didn't want to make. So instead of making those choices, they chose to leave the gold standard, right? But that doesn't mean that gold failed. That's people, human beings failed, right? And Bitcoin doesn't fix that. Donald Trump has made it clear that we can't have these trade deficits. And okay, that means we're leaving the dollar's reserve status because it's a consequence. Our trade deficits are a consequence of the dollar being the reserve currency. And that's what enables us to live beyond our means. And this is in the process of ending. During that time, you didn't see a lot of public interest in gold. I mean, most Americans were selling gold for that entire run. It's been central banks that have been accumulating. And why are they accumulating gold? Because they are divesting of dollars, right? They are converting their dollars into gold, and they're shunning the interest that they could earn, because when you have dollars, you could buy treasuries and earn 4%. When you have gold, you earn nothing. In fact, you got to pay a little bit of money to store it, or maybe you've got your own storage facility, but you got to pay for the facility. It doesn't cost anything to store treasuries, and you get paid a yield. But the fact that these foreign central banks don't want that yield shows you that they realize the yield is not enough to make up for the loss of value of the dollar. And so they'd rather own gold that yields nothing than dollars that yield something. And so far, the return that they've had on their gold dwarfs the little bit of interest they would have earned on their dollars. And I think for that reason, gold's going to keep on rising. If you look at the amount of gold that most central banks own, particularly in the emerging markets and the countries that have the largest surpluses with the US, they have the most foreign exchange reserves. They still have a tiny fraction of those reserves allocated to gold. And they keep growing because they keep accumulating more dollars because they keep having these surpluses with us. So more and more of that money, of those currencies, are going to move into gold. So gold is replacing the dollar as the primary monetary reserve. It's not the euro that's replacing the dollar or the pound or the yen or the RMB or any of these currencies. It's real money. I mean, because before the dollar was the primary reserve, it was gold. And the only reason that the dollar was accepted as the reserve was because it was redeemable in gold. So if you had Federal Reserve notes in the 1950s and 1960s, you had gold. When they said the dollar was as good as gold, they meant it because the dollar was gold, except you could earn interest. Now, we screwed the world over when we defaulted on that promise, but it was initially gold that was the reason the world accepted the deal at Bretton Woods. So I think that is in the process of changing. But what's interesting from your perspective, and you should think about this, is if you're so sure that Bitcoin is the new gold, is superior to gold, is better than gold, why are these central banks not buying it now? Why are they all buying gold? If gold is the past and Bitcoin is the future, why are all these central banks ignoring Bitcoin and just buying gold? 40% of all the Bitcoin is owned by Americans. And about half of all the people in the world who own Bitcoin are Americans. So this is becoming an increasingly US thing, as Americans are some of the only people dumb enough to buy it. Like we're loading up on all this crap as the rest of the world is getting rid of theirs. They're selling us their Bitcoin, and they're buying real things. They're making real investments. They're building factories. They're making consumer goods that improve people's lives. What do? We manufacture meme coins. Moving away from the dollar to gold in the short run is a very bad thing for America, because we have built our whole economy on the dollar being the reserve currency. So that's the reason we can live beyond our means. That's why we can buy so much stuff that we don't produce. That's why there's all these goods, right? Donald Trump is pointing to the fact that Americans buy all this stuff from China and India and in Canada or Mexico or Europe or Southeast Asia, like all these different countries. Why is that? Why is all this stuff coming here? It's because they want our dollars. But the dollars don't really have any value. We just create them out of thin air. But because the dollar is the reserve currency, it has this value that it otherwise wouldn't have. And so we're able to buy a lot of stuff without having to pay for it with actual export. But because so much of the surpluses get recycled into our paper, right, we get artificially low interest rates.